Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a stream of consciousness rant on the topic of conductors behaving badly. What does that mean? Well, I've been so terribly disturbed by my recent encounter with Manfred Honeck's Beethoven Ninth with the Pittsburgh Symphony on reference recordings, a performance that should have been a knockout stunner, but wasn't, that I feel I need to say a few words and speculate about something that's going on, a bothersome trend in the world of music today. Now, there are a zillion conductors out there, as you know. Most of them are essentially anonymous non-persons, interpretively. You can substitute one for the other and you'd never notice the difference. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. Why? Because the ones who do tend to stick out often stick out for the wrong reasons, because they do things that are demented. Honeck, let's stick with the example of Honeck for a while. Honeck was a conductor who stuck out for the right reasons, because he had wonderful interpretive ideas and an amazing orchestra at his disposal, and he could realize them fabulously well. And it was wonderful to hear. But recently, with his Tchaikovsky Fourth and now with this Beethoven Ninth, he's indulging in all kinds of odd push me, pull you mannerisms and effects that seem to be singularly unrelated to the music that he's playing and which only draw attention to himself. Now, there are a couple of ways to think about this. Either he's had some sort of fit of narcissistic, egomaniacal self-regard, or alternately, there are things happening in the musical universe that encourage this kind of behavior. And that's the thing I want to explore. Because Honeck isn't alone. There are other conductors who do similar things for various reasons, and we'll talk about them too. But basically, let's start with a premise. There have always been conductors who had the ability to personalize their interpretations in such a way that you or I, any reasonably well experienced music listener, would know that it's this guy and not the other guy. For example, there were Karajan and Ormandy for voluptuous string sound. Fabulous, wonderful, voluptuous string sound. That was their sound. And they knew it, and they were proud of it. Or Otto Klemperer with his very forward wind balances. Or Leopold Stokowski, who was just nuts. Or Nikolai Golovanov, the Russian, who was even nuttier than Stokowski. Couldn't leave anything alone. They all had ways of personalizing a piece of music. Sometimes it led to perversity and to ridicule, and other times not. But there were also conductors who simply personalized the sound of the orchestra based on long experience, hard work, and they did it in subtle ways as well as obvious ones. Yes, there was beautiful string tone, but there was also a certain kind of ensemble balance. Zell had that, a transparency of tone and texture. These things are not the kinds of things that happen overnight. They're things that take a tremendous amount of time. That's exactly what conductors today do not have. But the goal of a lot of these guys, it seems to me, is to personalize their sound like those great conductors did. Only they have to do it in 15 minutes, not in 15 years, because that's how much rehearsal time they have. This is an issue. I think it's a tremendous issue, because as a result of that pressure, they tend to choose things to characterize their sound, their sonic approach, that are grotesquely obvious, things that are not subtle, not necessarily even musical. They're just gross timbral objectives. Let's take somebody like Osmo Venska. Osmo Venska is a terrific conductor, or was, before he got to Minnesota and all hell broke loose. And I always admired his work, but there was one mannerism that he always had. That was the super duper pianissimo. For example, in the finale, you can hear it most obviously in the finale of Sibelius's Fifth, where where after the swan theme, do, 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 after that shows up the first time, the movement recapitulates with the string tremolo things, and it's marked like double or triple piano. It's supposed to be quiet. But Venska, there was one moment in every single piece he conducted where he wasn't just very quiet, he was so quiet as to absolutely beggar audibility. I mean, it was unbelievable. And, initially when you heard it, you went, ooh, he really cares about dynamics. That's really great. And it is really great. It's great unless it becomes a mannerism, which it has since become, since he has applied that principle to all the levels of the dynamic spectrum in Minnesota, with the result that the music is fussy and the players sound inhibited, and it's as unnatural and micromanaged as can be. And there have always been micromanagers out there too. People used to consider Toscanini as the ultimate micromanager, but he really wasn't compared to what's going on today. Claudio Abbado became a terrible micromanager in his later years, but he didn't start out that way. And that's what's happening with a lot of these people. Honeck did not start out as this sort of mannered, effective thing that we heard in that Tchaikovsky Fourth and Beethoven's Ninth. His earlier recordings of Beethoven's symphonies were fabulous. Fabulous, wonderful, and I'm hoping he returns to doing wonderful things. But it seems to me that one of the pressures that encourages this kind of behavior is the need to do something to identify yourself quickly, so that you make a name at a time when it's harder and harder because conductors don't spend quality time with individual orchestras. Although Honeck is in Pittsburgh. But even then, what is a season these days? 16 weeks of dedicated time. The rest of the time, conductors are flying around guesting, playing the same music with every orchestra that they encounter. So how do they make that sound unique? Well, one of the big guys to answer that question, and this is the second and perhaps most interesting of all of the elements that encourage conductors to behave badly. The conductor who did that most of all recently was Roger Norrington. And the business with period instrument folderol and the lack of vibrato. Because in order to get a modern orchestra to sound like period instrument group, all you have to do is say to the string players, stop playing with vibrato. And you immediately get that thin, anemic, horrible string sound that we hear in so many period instrument groups. Voila! That was the Norrington sound, essentially, and everything else flowed from that. But there's a deeper issue with the period performance movement, because all of those older conductors, Karajan, Ormandy, Klemperer, Toscanini, whoever you want to pick, who had their identifiable sound, they were working within a well-defined parameter, within a historical tradition of performance and performance practice. Yes, it may have changed slightly over time, but one of the things that I've been studying, and I've come to the conclusion and have evidence to show, is that the degree to which these things changed over time is probably quite a bit less than the period instrument people would have us believe. Yes, they changed. How much exactly, we really can't say, and we really don't know. But there is no doubt that the players and the conductors who we are most admire, the ones who were born from anywhere from the 1860s, like Toscanini, to the 1890s and early 1900s, like Zell and those guys, they all came from the same tradition. And that tradition, we have to understand, is not a very old one in itself. I mean, think about it. If you think about someone like Toscanini, who had an enormous influence on subsequent conductors, if he was born in the 1860s, and he was, and he died, in 1950-something, he was 90-something, whatever it was, or 80, 90, 90-something. The bottom line is that was we're only talking 30-some-odd, 40 years after the death of Beethoven. And Beethoven is the seminal figure because Beethoven was the composer for whom the modern orchestra was invented. The first constituent orchestra, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which became the model for all of the other orchestras in Europe, was founded specifically in the 1820s for the purpose of playing Beethoven. And only a few decades later, Toscanini is born. I mean, the great modern conductor who lived to make recordings in experimental stereo. in the 1950s. So the point is, we tend to think of the period of Beethoven's life as far away and distant, but in terms of the tradition of performance practice passed on from teacher to pupil, it's only a couple generations away. You have to ask yourself, how much could things possibly have changed? Not technologically, not in terms of instrument construction and all those things, but in terms of what the timbral ideal was, what allegro meant, what a crescendo meant, what espressivo meant when it came to be a question of when do you add vibrato or not to a note in a string part. These things followed a path, a well-connected path. And the great irony, the tremendous irony, is that this extremely well-connected path, with musicians taking huge pride in their pedigree, in the school from which they came, that was taught to them going back a few generations, that tradition is gone. And one of the reasons it's gone is because of the period instrument movement. Because the period instrument movement has told these people, and they're dumb enough to believe it, some of them, that whole tradition doesn't make any difference. What matters is what some academic fusty dope can read or misread in a treatise written around the time the composer was around, or some eyewitness account of something that happened at a performance. But we don't know that any of that information is correct. We don't know what any of this stuff sounded like. The best evidence for what music sounded like in Beethoven's time was modern orchestral playing in the tradition going back to Beethoven. That was the best thing that we had. And one of the things that I've discovered in my own research, if you go back and look, is that tradition is reliably correct. It does reflect what was happening at the time if you gather together the right sources and if you treat them with a certain level of intellectual rigor. I could take out, and I'm not going to do it here because it'll bore you, but I could take out some of the major Bibles of period instrument performance and show you chapter and verse, just how horribly the original sources get used. And musicians who are practical performing musicians, and most of whom are not scholars, they listen to these people because they say, oh, well, it's a scholar. I'm not a scholar. And they just do it. They do what they're told to do on the basis of the fact that it's going to make their interpretation sound different. They want anything they can grab to personalize a performance. Because remember, they're playing all the same stuff. They're playing all the same stuff that the greatest musicians that ever lived have played. And all of those greatest musicians have now been recorded. And those recordings exist. And anyone can compare them. And so the need to create a new sound is tremendous. You can't overestimate the pressure on a conductor to come up with a new sound. So there are two factors involved. And the irony, the first factor, I just mentioned, was the fact that conductors don't have a lot of time. They have to do something really obvious, really sort of grotesquely obvious, number one. And number two, they no longer can rely on the operative tradition within which to operate. They can pick any bizarre theory they want to pick. Doesn't matter how stupid it is, and then they'll just go with it. I mean, some of you may recall this demented conductor named Maximiano Cobra, who had a theory about Beethoven's metronome markings. Beethoven's metronome markings are controversial at the best of times, right? And a lot of them are impractical and don't work. And there's excellent evidence that they were physically impossible to execute at the time. And that had Beethoven actually had a chance to work with them and practice with them in like real life, he probably would never have used them in the first place. But all of that's something for, again, a topic for another day. Cobra decided that Beethoven's metronome markings actually meant that the tempos should be half the speed that they indicate. And he made some DVDs, including one of Beethoven's Ninth, played throughout at 50% the normal tempos. It takes about an hour and 50 minutes to get through it. And there's a wonderful moment, where the video is focusing on the orchestra, and they look at a horn player, and he's sitting there with his head in his hands going like, oh God, when is this going to be over? It just looks like he's dying. He's got these pickup orchestra, they're playing along, and of course they could probably learn to play their instruments in the time it takes to go from one note to the next. I mean, the performances are just abominable, but he had a theory, and it's perverse, yes, but he had a theory. The period instrument movement has disrupted the chain, the legacy of our historical performance traditions, and substituted for that whatever trendy theory the artist wishes to adopt in order to make himself sound different. So that's the second factor, I think, that allows us to hear these weird interpretations by people who really, I mean, they really ought to know better. They really do. And we see it in Honek's performance. He talks about Beethoven's metronome markings. He talks about handling a vibrato in the period, all as if they really know. And that's the joke. They don't know squat about what it really sounded like or what people may have done. They really don't. But he has this apparatus that validates his choices, so he can make these choices. And if the choices sound perverse and ridiculous, it's not his fault. He can say, "Oh, well, Dr. Brautschleimer and the Leipzig Bach Stiftung said that this is the way it's supposed to go. And so that's the way I'm going to do it. And it's totally proven that that's correct." Well, no, it isn't. And what's more, if it sounds like trash, it probably is. You got to trust your ears, right? So that's the second factor. Now, what is the third factor? The third factor that I think encourages conductors to behave badly is the fact that they can. It's the fact that today's orchestras are so much better than today's conductors. They are. They're demonstrably superior. They have the tradition. They have the heritage. They have the day in, day out experience of creating a true ensemble and playing together. And because they're so good, because they're so talented, they can do anything the conductor tells them to do, and quickly. Very, very quickly. And the conductor gets the credit for whatever happens. And they're professionals. They're trained to do whatever the conductor tells them to do. And so that's what happens. And you get these very, very strange results that are arrived at after only a few rehearsals at major moments and major points where we say, this has to stand out. Okay, guys, super duper pianissimo. And there it goes. Or no vibrato. There it goes. That's what happens. And you put those three factors together, and I will recapitulate them one more time just so we all know the short amount of time conductors have to create a personal sound, the interruption in the normal legacy of performance practice and tradition, largely produced by the period instrument movement, and finally, the fact that the orchestras are so much better at what they do than the conductors are. And conductors, quite often, just move in, pick the spots that they want to stick out, and there you go. Instant personal interpretation. Now, whether it's musical, whether it's idiomatic, who knows? It doesn't really matter because the critics or the people listening to it listen to it, and if they know the piece well, they go, aha, that sounds different. And different is always good, because different must be good, because it's different. It's kind of a bit of circular reasoning, right? And then there is one other factor that I think really applies to music directors in regular orchestral circumstances, and that is the unprecedented amount of PR and cult of personality development. I mean, if you've been watching anything about the second Trump impeachment trial, you should know all that you need to know about how harmful a cult of personality is. And it's just as harmful in the arts. Don't get me wrong. I am not saying that, the conductor-orchestra relationship should be democratic. It shouldn't be. There is no democracy in the performing arts in that sense. You need to have a leader. He needs to tell you what to do. That's true. But one of the problems is that, especially I think in American orchestras, and it's also infected European orchestras. It's certainly infected, Stuttgart under Norrington, and to a certain extent Munich under Celibidache, and you know which ones I mean, right? It's the idea that these guys are so goddamn special, and they begin to believe their own PR. They live in a bubble. They live in a bubble. They are surrounded by handlers and people telling them how fabulous they are and how unique they are and how wonderful they are. And this, again, is a self-reinforcing mechanism because they feel they have to live up to that reputation, number one. Not that it matters if they do or don't, because the PR people are going to say the same thing, irrespective of what they actually do. But the ones who begin to take that seriously can become very, very detached, shall we say, detached from, I think from the music, from their public, from the norms of interpretation, from the standards of supreme musicianship that they pretend to uphold. Because when you can do no wrong, you tend to lose your ability to be self-critical. And I'm not saying that this has happened to any of the gentlemen who I'm mentioning. I won't say that. But I will say that I can understand it happening. And I've done interviews with so many of these people over time. And some of them really are living in another universe, in a galaxy long ago and far, far away. They are not reachable or amenable to normal human discourse. I'll give you an example. I'm not going to name a name because I just don't think that would be polite, but I'm going to give you the example. I was asked to speak to a hotshot young conductor, and I was sitting there in the anteroom of his PR person here in Manhattan prior to doing the interview, and he was sitting there doing absolutely nothing. I could see him in the other room doing nothing, and I was on time, and he was making me wait. He was making me wait just because he could. Not because he was busy. He was out looking at his fingernails and, licking his chops or whatever he was doing, just sitting there. So anyway, the bastard finally let me in and we start talking. And I said to him, your record label is asking you to record a lot of repertoire with this particular orchestra. It's all been done before with this particular orchestra. What makes your vision in this music that's been done before by this particular orchestra unique? I asked him that. And he looked at me and he said, I don't give a shit about any of my recordings. But you can't say that. You have to make me look good. And I just looked at him and I said, oh, no, I don't. Thank you. And I walked out. I mean, that's a true story. That really happened. I mean, there was a little more back and forth before I walked out, but that was the upshot of the whole thing. I mean, this was somebody who had nothing to say, no interest in saying it. But he was the creation of this PR mechanism. He probably liked music at some level. He was out doing his job. His recordings didn't impress me particularly, but that is the kind of thing that happens. And it's even worse in a way when you have someone who has real talent, who has real ability, because then the talent can go crazy. It can run amok. You put him in front of an orchestra that has the infinite ability to realize any intention that he may have, and all hell breaks loose. That's another issue, I think, the fact that these artists are coddled. So these are just my thoughts about what is going on with these conductors. They are rootless. They no longer operate within the valid, legitimate parameters of our performance history. They have very little time to do something that's going to stand out and get the attention of everybody today in music that we've all heard a billion times, that the orchestra's played a billion times. I mean, that's a big issue. And finally, they have this I don't know. They have this strange relationship with the orchestra that they know is better than they are, and they need to assert their authority by making them do something. And these orchestras are so good that they can do anything that they're told to do, and they will. Because what's it to them? It's their job. That's what happens. And that, I think, gives you a sense of where we are today and what I find so disturbing. You may disagree. I'd be interested to hear your views on why it is that there are just so many conductors out there, talented ones. There are hopeless frauds like Norrington, but there are also very gifted ones, like I believe like Honeck, and I think Venska is one of them. I mean, people who really have ability. Abato is one of them, or was one of them, but they go astray. They go astray for any number of reasons, and the recorded evidence is there if you care to hear it. I don't know what to do about it, but I did want to bring it up. We will only find out the truth if we keep on listening. So thank you for letting me rant and rave and reflect. I know this wandered a little bit, but these are my thoughts, and I just felt that I had to share them. It used to be just, before I close, it used to be that, I would walk around the apartment or my house mumbling to myself about these problems. And some of you might very, very heartily wish that I still did that rather than talking to you, but you're there, and I have this opportunity to share them with you, and I'm interested in hearing what your take on it is as well, because I think this is a real issue. I really do, and I'm very curious to see what you think about it. So thank you for letting me bounce these ideas off of you all. Take care. Bye-bye.